Chapter 28. There is no need of going into an extended recital of our suffering in the small boat during the many days we were driven and drifted here and there, willy-nilly across the sea. The high wind blew from the northwest for 24 hours when it fell calm, and in the night sprang up from the southwest. This was dead in our teeth, but I took in the sea anchor and set sail, hauling a course on the wind, which took us in a southeasterly direction. It was an even choice between this and the west-northwesterly course which the wind permitted, but the warm airs of the south fanned my desire for a warmer sea and swayed my decision. In 3 hours, it was midnight, I well remember, as dark as I had ever seen it on the sea. The wind, still blowing out the southwest, rose furiously, and once again I was compelled to set the sea anchor. Day broke and found me wan-eyed, and the ocean lashed white, the boat pitching almost on end to its drag. We were in imminent danger of being swamped by the whitecaps. As it was, spray and spume came aboard in such quantities that I bailed without cessation. The blankets were soaking. Everything was wet except Maud, and she, in oilskins, rubber boots, and sou'wester, was dry, all but her face and hands and a stray wisp of hair. She relieved me at the bailing hole from time to time, and bravely she threw out the water and faced the storm. All things are relative. It was no more than a stiff blow, but to us, fighting for life in our frail craft, it was indeed a storm. Cold and cheerless, the wind beating on our faces, the white seas roaring by, we struggled through the day. Night came, but neither of us slept. Day came, and still the wind beat on our faces, and the white seas roared past. By the second night, Maud was falling asleep from exhaustion. I covered her with oilskins and tarpaulin. She was comparatively dry, but she was numb with the cold. I feared greatly that she might die in the night. But day broke, cold and cheerless, with the same clouded sky and beating wind and roaring seas. I had had no sleep for 48 hours. I was wet and chilled to the marrow, till I felt more dead than alive. My body was stiff from exertion as well as from cold, and my aching muscles gave me the severest torture whenever I used them, and I used them continually. And all the time we were being driven off into the northeast, directly away from Japan and toward the bleak Bering Sea. And still we lived, and the boat lived, and the wind blew unabated. In fact, toward nightfall of the third day it increased a trifle, and something more. The boat's bow plunged under a crest, and we came through quarterful of water. I bailed like a madman. The liability of shipping another such sea was enormously increased by the water that weighed the boat down and robbed it of its buoyancy. And another such sea meant the end. When I had the boat empty again, I was forced to take away the tarpaulin which covered Maud in order that I might lash it down across the bow. It was well I did, for it covered the boat fully a third of the way aft, and 3 times in the next several hours it flung off the bulk of the down-rushing water when the bow shoved under the seas. Maud's condition was pitiable. She sat crouched in the bottom of the boat, her lips blue, her face gray, and plainly showing the pain she suffered. But ever her eyes looked bravely at me, and her lips uttered brave words. The worst of the storm must have blown that night, though little I noticed it. I had succumbed and slept where I sat in the stern sheets. The morning of the 4th day found the wind diminished to a gentle whisper, the sea dying down, and the sun shining upon us. Oh, the blessed sun! How we bathed our poor bodies in its delicious warmth. reviving like bugs and crawling things after a storm. We smiled again, said amusing things, and waxed optimistic over our situation. Yet it was, if anything, worse than ever. We were farther from Japan than the night we left the Ghost, nor could I more than roughly guess our latitude and longitude. At a calculation of a 2-mile drift per hour during the 70 and odd hours of the storm, we had been driven at least 150 miles to the northeast. But was such calculated drift correct? For all I knew, it might have been 4 miles per hour instead of 2, in which case we were another 150 miles to the bad. Where we were, I did not know, though there was quite a likelihood that we were in the vicinity of the Ghost. There were seals about us, and I was prepared to sight a sealing schooner at any time. We did sight one in the afternoon when the northwest breeze had sprung up freshly once more, but the strange schooner lost itself on the skyline, and we alone occupied the circle of the sea. Came days of fog when Maud's spirit drooped, and there were no merry words upon her lips, days of calm when we floated on the lonely immensity of the sea, oppressed by its greatness and yet marveling at the miracle of tiny life. For we lived and struggled to live, days of sleet and wind and snow squalls, when nothing could keep us warm, or days of drizzling rain when we filled our water breakers from the drip of the wet sail. And ever I loved Maud with an increasing love. She was so many-sided, so many-mooded, protean-mooded, I called her. But I called her this and other and dearer things in my thoughts only, though the declaration of my love urged and trembled on my tongue 1,000 times. I knew that it was no time for such a declaration. If for no other reason, it was no time, when one was protecting and trying to save a woman, to ask that woman for her love. Delicate as was the situation, not alone in this but in other ways, I flattered myself that I was able to deal delicately with it. And also I flattered myself that by look or sign I gave no advertisement of the love I felt for her. We were like good comrades, and we grew better comrades as the days went by. One thing about her which surprised me was her lack of timidity and fear. The terrible sea, the frail boat, the storms, the suffering, the strangeness, and the isolation of the situation, all that should have frightened a robust woman, seemed to make no impression upon her, who had known life only in its most sheltered and consummately artificial aspect, and who was herself all fire and dew and mist, sublimated spirit, all that was soft and tender and clinging in woman. And yet I am wrong. She was timid and afraid, but she possessed courage. The flesh and qualms of the flesh she was heir to, but the flesh bore heavily only on the flesh. And she was spirit, first and always spirit, etherealized essence of life, calm as her calm eyes, and sure of permanence in the changing order of the universe. Came days of storm, days and nights of storm, when the ocean menaced us with its roaring whiteness, and the wind smote our struggling boat with a Titan's buffets. And ever we were flung off, farther and farther, to the northeast. It was in such a storm, and the worst that we had experienced, that I cast a weary glance to leeward, not in quest of anything, but more from the weariness of facing the elemental strife, and in mute appeal, almost, to the wrathful powers to cease and let us be. What I saw, I could not at first believe. Days and nights of sleeplessness and anxiety had doubtless turned my head. I looked back at Maud, to identify myself, as it were, in time and space. The sight of her dear wet cheeks, her flying hair, and her brave brown eyes convinced me that my vision was still healthy. Again I turned my face to leeward, and again I saw the jutting promontory, black and high and naked, the raging surf that broke about its base and beat its front high up with spouting fountains, the black and forbidden coastline running toward the southeast and fringed with a tremendous scarf of white. "Maud," I said. "Maud." She turned her head and beheld the sight. "It cannot be Alaska," she cried. "Alas, no," I answered and asked, "Can you swim?" She shook her head. "Neither can I said. "So we must get ashore without swimming in some opening between the rocks, which we can drive the boat and clamber out. But we must be quick, most quick and sure." I spoke with confidence she knew I did not feel, for she looked at me with the unfaltering gaze of hers and said, "I have not thanked you yet for all you have done for me, but—" She hesitated, as if in doubt how best to word her gratitude. "Well," I said brutally, for I was not quite pleased with her thanking me. "You might help me," she smiled. "To acknowledge your obligations before you die? Not at all. We are not going to die. We shall land on that island, and we shall be snug and sheltered before the day is done." I spoke stoutly, but I did not believe a word, nor was I prompted to lie through fear. I felt no fear, though I was sure of death in that boiling surge amongst the rocks, which was rapidly growing nearer. It was impossible to hoist sail and claw off that shore. The wind would instantly capsize the boat. The seas would swamp it the moment it fell in the trough, and besides, the sail, lashed to the spare oars, dragged in the sea ahead of us. As I say, I was not afraid to meet my own death, there, a few hundred yards to leeward, but I was appalled at the thought that Maud must die. My cursed imagination saw her beaten and mangled against the rocks, and it was too terrible. I strove to compel myself to think we would make the landing safely, and so I spoke, not what I believed, but what I preferred to believe. I recoiled before contemplation of that frightful death, and for a moment I entertained the wild idea of seizing Maud in my arms and leaping overboard. Then I resolved to wait, and at the last moment, when we entered on the final stretch, to take her in my arms and proclaim my love, and with her in my embrace, to make the desperate struggle and die. Instinctively, we drew closer together in the bottom of the boat. I felt her mittened hand come out to mine, and thus, without speech, we waited the end. We were not far off the line the wind made with the western edge of the promontory, and I watched in hope that some set of the current or send of the sea would drift us past before we reached the surf. "We shall go clear," I said with a confidence which I knew deceived neither of us. "By God, we will go clear," I cried 5 minutes later. The oath left my lips in excitement. The first, I do believe, in my life, unless trouble it, an expletive of my youth, be accounted an oath. "I beg your pardon," I said. "You have convinced me of your sincerity," she said, with a faint smile. "I do know now that we shall go clear." I had seen a distant headland past the extreme edge of the promontory, and as we looked we could see grow the intervening coastline of what was evidently a deep cove. At the same time there broke upon our ears a continuous and mighty bellowing. It partook the magnitude and volume of distant thunder, and it came to us directly from leeward, rising above the crash of the surf and traveling directly in the sea of the storm. As we passed the point, the whole cove burst upon our view, a half-moon of white sandy beach upon which broke a huge surf, and which was covered with myriads of seals. It was from them that the great bellowing went up. "A rookery!" I cried. "Now are we indeed saved. There must be men in cruisers to protect them from seal hunters. Possibly there is a station ashore." But as I studied the surf which beat upon the beach, I said, "Still bad, but not so bad. And now if the gods be truly kind, we shall drift by that next headland and come upon a perfectly sheltered beach, where we may land without wetting our feet." And the gods were kind. The first and second headlands were directly in line with the southwest wind, but once around the second, and we went perilously near, we picked up the third headland, still in line with the wind and with the other two. But the cove that intervened, it penetrated deep into the land, and the tide setting in drifted us under the shelter of the point. Here the sea was calm, save for a heavy but smooth groundswell, and I took in the sea anchor and began to row. From the point the shore curved away more and more to the south and west, until at last it disclosed a cove within the cove, a little landlocked harbor, the water level as a pond, broken only by tiny ripples where vagrant breaths and wisps of the storm hurtled down from over the frowning wall of rock that backed the beach from 100 feet inshore. Here there were no seals whatever. The boat's stern touched the hard shingle. I sprang out, extending my hand to Maud. The next moment she was beside me. As my fingers released hers, she clutched for my arm hastily. At the same moment I swayed, as about to fall to the sand. This was the startling effect of the cessation of motion. We had been so long upon the moving, rocking sea that the stable land was a shock to us. We expected the beach to lift up this way and that, and the rocky walls to swing back and forth like the sides of a ship. And when we braced ourselves automatically for these various expected movements, their non-occurrence quite overcame our equilibrium. "I really must sit down," Maud said, with a nervous laugh and a dizzy gesture, and forthwith she sat down on the sand. I attended to making the boat secure and joined her. Thus, we landed on Endeavor Island as we came to it, landsick from long custom of the sea. Chapter 29. "Fool!" I cried aloud in my vexation. I had unloaded the boat and carried its contents high up on the beach, where I had set about making a camp. There was driftwood, though not much, on the beach, and the sight of a coffee tin I had taken from the ghost's larder had given me the idea of a fire. "Blithering idiot," I was continuing, but Maud said, "Tut, tut," in gentle reproval, and then asked why I was a blithering idiot. "No matches," I groaned. "Not a match did I bring, and now we shall have no hot coffee, soup, tea, or anything." "Wasn't it, Crusoe who rubbed sticks together?" she drawled. "But I have read the personal narratives of a score of shipwrecked men who tried and tried in vain," I answered. "I remember Winters, a newspaper fellow with an Alaskan and Siberian reputation. Met him at the Bible lot once, and he was telling us how he attempted to make a fire with a couple of sticks. It was most amusing. He told it inimitably, but it was the story of a failure. I remember his conclusion, his black eyes flashing as he said, 'Gentlemen, the South Sea Islander may do it, the Malay may do it, but take my word, it's beyond the white man.'" "Oh, well, we've managed so far without it," she said cheerfully, and there's no reason why we cannot still manage without it. But think of the coffee, I cried. It's good coffee, too, I know. I took it from Larson's private stores. And look at that good wood. I confess I wanted the coffee badly, and I learned, not long afterward, that the berry was likewise a little weakness of Maud's. Besides, we had been so long on a cold diet that we were numb inside as well as out. Anything warm would have been most gratifying, but I complained no more and set about making a tent of the sail for Maud. I had looked upon it as a simple task, what of the oars, mast, boom, and sprit, to say nothing of plenty of lines. But as I was without experience, and as every detail was an experiment, and every successful detail an invention, the day was well gone before her shelter was an accomplished fact. And then, that night, it rained, and she was flooded out and driven back into the boat. The next morning, I dug a shallow ditch around the tent, and an hour later, a sudden gust of wind whipping over the rocky wall behind us picked up the tent and smashed it down in the sand 30 yards away. Maud laughed at my crestfallen expression, and I said, "As soon as the wind abates, I intend going in the boat to explore the island. There must be a station somewhere, and men. And ships must visit the station. Some government must protect all these seals. But I wish to have you comfortable before I start." "I should like to go with you," was all she said. "It would be better if you remained. You have had enough of hardship. It is a miracle that you have survived, and it won't be comfortable in the boat, rowing and sailing in this rainy weather. What you need is rest, and I should like you to remain and get it." Something suspiciously akin to moistness dimmed her beautiful eyes before she dropped them and partly turned away her head. "I should prefer going with you," she said in a low voice, in which there was just a hint of appeal. "I might be able to help you, her voice broke, a little. And if anything should happen to you, think of me left here alone." "Oh, I intend being very careful," I answered, "and I shall not go so far but what I can get back before tonight. Yes, all said and done, I think it vastly better for you to remain and sleep and rest and do nothing." She turned and looked me in the eyes. Her gaze was unfaltering, but soft. "Please, please," she said, oh so softly. I stiffened myself to refuse and shook my head. Still she waited and looked at me. I tried to word my refusal, but wavered. I saw the glad light spring into her eyes and knew that I had lost. It was impossible to say no after that. The wind died down in the afternoon, and we were prepared to start the following morning. There was no way of penetrating the island from our cove, for the walls rose perpendicularly from the beach, and on the other side of the cove rose from the deep water. Morning broke, dull and gray, but calm, and I was awake early and had the boat in readiness. "Fool! Imbecile! Yahoo!" I shouted, when I thought it was meet to arouse Maud. This time I shouted in merriment as I danced about the beach, bareheaded, in mock despair. Her head appeared under the flap of the sail. "What now?" she asked sleepily, and withal curiously. "Coffee!" I cried. "What do you say to a cup of coffee? Hot coffee. Piping hot." "My," she murmured, "you startled me, and you are cruel. Here I have been composing my soul to do without it, and here you are vexing me with your vain suggestions. Watch me, I said. From under clefts among the rocks I gathered a few dry sticks and chips. These I dwindled into shavings or split into kindling. From my notebook I tore out the page, and from the ammunition box took a shotgun shell. Removing the wads from the letter with my knife, I emptied the powder on a flat rock. Next, I pried the primer or cap from the shell and laid it on the rock in the midst of the scattered powder. All was ready. Maud still watched from the tent. Holding the paper in my left hand, I smashed down upon the cap with a rock held in my right. There was a puff of white smoke, a burst of flame, and the rough edge of paper was alight. Maud clapped her hands gleefully. "Prometheus!" she cried. But I was too occupied to acknowledge her delight. The feeble flame must be cherished tenderly if it were to gather strength and live. I fed it, shaving by shaving and sliver by sliver, till at last it was snapping and crackling as it laid hold of the smaller chips and sticks. To be cast away on an island had not entered into my calculations, so we were without a kettle or cooking utensils of any sort. But I made shift with the tin used for bailing the boat, and later, as we consumed our supply of canned goods, we accumulated quite an imposing array of cooking vessels. I boiled the water, but it was Maud who made the coffee. And how good it was! My contribution was canned beef fried with crumbled sea biscuit and water. The breakfast was a success, and we sat about the fire much longer than enterprising explorers should have done, sipping the hot black coffee and talking over our situation. I was confident that we should find a station in some one of the coves, for I knew that the rookeries of Bering Sea were thus guarded, but Maud advanced the theory to prepare me for disappointment, I do believe, if disappointment were to come, that we had discovered an unknown rookery. She was in very good spirits, however, and made quite merry in accepting our plight as a grave one. "If you are right," I said, "then we must prepare to winter here. Our food will not last, but there are the seals. They go away in the fall, so I must soon begin to lay in a supply of meat. Then there will be huts to build and driftwood to gather. Also, we shall try out seal fat for lighting purposes. Altogether, we'll have our hands full if we find the island uninhabited, which we shall not, I know." But she was right. We sailed with a beam wind along the shore, searching the coves with our glasses and landing occasionally without finding a sign of human life. Yet we learned that we were not the first who landed on Endeavour Island. High up on the beach of the second cove from ours, we discovered the splintered wreck of a boat, a sealer's boat, for the rowlocks were bound in sennit. A gun rack was on the starboard side of the bow, and in white letters was faintly visible Gazelle No. 2. The boat had lain there for a long time, for it was half filled with sand, and the splintered wood had that weather-worn appearance due to long exposure to the elements. In the stern sheets, I found a rusty 10-gauge shotgun and a sailor's sheath knife broken short across and so rusted as to be almost unrecognizable. "They got away," I said cheerfully, but I felt a sinking at the heart and seemed to divine the presence of bleached bones somewhere on that beach. I did not wish Maud's spirits to be dampened by such a find, so I turned seaward again with our boat and skirted the northeastern point of the island. There were no beaches on the southern shore, and by early afternoon we rounded the black promontory and completed the circumnavigation of the island. I estimated its circumference at 25 miles, its width as varying from 2 to 5 miles, while my most conservative calculation placed on its beaches 200,000 seals. The island was highest at its extreme southwestern point, the headlands and backbone diminishing regularly until the northeastern portion was only a few feet above the sea. With the exception of our little cove, the other beaches sloped gently back for a distance of half a mile or so into what I might call Rocky Mountains, with here and there patches of moss and tundra grass. Here the seals hauled out, and the old bulls guarded their harems, while the young bulls hauled out by themselves. This brief description is all that Endeavor Island merits. Damp and soggy where it was not sharp and rocky, buffeted by storm winds and lashed by the sea, with the air continually a-tremble with the bellowing of 200,000 amphibians, it was a melancholy and miserable sojourning place. Maud, who had prepared me for disappointment, and who had been sprightly and vivacious all day, broke down as we landed in our own little cove. She strove bravely to hide it from me, but while I was kindling another fire, I knew she was stifling her sobs in the blankets under the sail tent. It was my turn to be cheerful, and I played the part to the best of my ability, and with such success that I brought the laughter back into her dear eyes and song on her lips, for she sang to me before she went to an early bed. It was the first time I had heard her sing, and I lay by the fire, listening and transported, for she was nothing if not an artist in everything she did, and her voice, though not strong, was wonderfully sweet and expressive. I still slept in the boat, and I lay awake long that night, gazing up at the first stars I had seen in many nights and pondering the situation. Responsibility of this sort was a new thing to me. Wolf Larsen had been quite right. I had stood on my father's legs. My lawyers and agents had taken care of my money for me. I had had no responsibilities at all. Then, on the Ghost, I had learned to be responsible for myself. And now, for the first time in my life, I found myself responsible for someone else. And it was required of me that this should be the gravest of responsibilities, for she was the one woman in the world, the one small woman, as I love to think of her. Chapter 30. No wonder we called it Endeavor Island. For 2 weeks we toiled at building a hut. Maud insisted on helping, and I could have wept over her bruised and bleeding hands. And still I was proud of her because of it. There was something heroic about this gently bred woman enduring our terrible hardship, and with her pittance of strength bending to the tasks of a peasant woman. She gathered many of the stones which I built into the walls of the hut. Also, she turned a deaf ear to my entreaties when I begged her to desist. She compromised, however, by taking upon herself the lighter labors of cooking and gathering driftwood and moss for our winter's supply. The hut's walls rose without difficulty, and everything went smoothly until the problem of the roof confronted me. Of what use the 4 walls without a roof? And of what could a roof be made? There were the spare oars, very true. They would serve as roof beams. But with what was I to cover them? Moss would never do. Tundra grass was impracticable. We needed a sail for the boat, and the tarpaulin had begun to leak. Winters used walrus skins on his hut, I said. There are the seals, she suggested. So next day the hunting began. I did not know how to shoot, but I proceeded to learn, and when I had expended some 30 shells for 3 seals, I decided that the ammunition would be exhausted before I acquired the necessary knowledge. I had used 8 shells for lighting fires before I hit upon the device of banking the embers with wet moss, and there remained not over 100 shells in the box. We must club the seals, I announced, when convinced of my poor marksmanship. I have heard the sealers talk about clubbing them. They are so pretty, she objected. I cannot bear to think of it being done. It is so directly brutal, you know, so different from shooting them. That roof must go on, I answered grimly. Winter is almost here. It is our lives against theirs. It is unfortunate we haven't plenty of ammunition, but I think anyway that they suffer less from being clubbed than from being all shot up. Besides, I shall do the clubbing. That's just it, she began eagerly, and broke off in sudden confusion. Of course, I began, if you prefer. But what shall I be doing, she interrupted, with that softness I knew full well to be insistence. Gathering firewood and cooking dinner, I answered lightly. She shook her head. Is it too dangerous for you to attempt alone? I know, she waved my protest. I am only a weak woman, but just my small assistance may enable you to escape disaster. But the clubbing, I suggested. Of course you will do that. I shall probably scream. I look away when the danger is most serious, I laughed. I shall use my judgment, when to look and when not to look, she replied, with a grand air. The upshot of the affair was that she accompanied me next morning. I rowed into the adjoining cove and up to the edge of the beach. There were seals all about us in the water, and the bellowing thousands on the beach compelled us to shout at each other to make ourselves heard. I know men club them, I said, trying to reassure myself, and gazing doubtfully at a large bull, not 30 feet away, upreared on his foreflippers and regarded me intently. But the question is, how do they club them? Let us gather tundra grass and thatch the roof, Maud said. She was as frightened as I at the prospect, and we had reason to be gazing at close range at the gleaming teeth and dog-like mouths. I always thought they were afraid of men, I said. How do I know they are not afraid? I queried a moment later, after having rowed a few more strokes along the beach. Perhaps if I were to step boldly ashore, they would cut for it, and I could not catch up with one. And still I hesitated. I heard of a man once who invaded the nesting grounds of wild geese, Maud said. They killed him. The geese? Yes, the geese. My brother told me about it when I was a little girl. But I know men club them, I persisted. I think the tundra grass will make just as good a roof, she said. Far from her intention, her words were maddening me, driving me on. I could not play the coward before her eyes. Here goes, I said, backing water with one oar and running the boat ashore. I stepped out and advanced valiantly upon a long-maned bull in the midst of his knives. I was armed with a regular club with which the boat pullers killed the wounded seals gaffed aboard by the hunters. It was only 1.5 feet long, and in my superb ignorance I never dreamed that the club used ashore when raiding the rookeries measured 4 to 5 feet. The cows lumbered out of my way, and the distance between me and the bull decreased. He raised himself on his flippers with an angry movement. We were a dozen feet apart. Still, I advanced steadily, looking for him to turn tail at any moment and run. At 6 feet, the panicky thought rushed into my mind. What if he will not run? Why then shall I club him, came the answer. In my fear I had forgotten that I was there to get the bull instead of make him run. And just then he gave a snort and a snarl and rushed at me. His eyes were blazing, his mouth was wide open. The teeth gleamed cruelly white. Without shame, I confess that it was I who turned and footed it. He ran awkwardly, but he ran well. He was but 2 paces behind when I tumbled into the boat, and as I shoved off with an oar, his teeth crunched down upon the blade. The stout wood was crushed like an eggshell. Maud and I were astounded. A moment later, he had dived under the boat and seized the keel in his mouth and was shaking the boat violently. "My," Maud said, "let's go back." I shook my head. I can do what other men have done, and I know that other men have clubbed seals, but I think I'll leave the bulls alone next time. "I wish you wouldn't," she said. "Now don't say please, please," I cried half angrily, I do believe. She made no reply. I knew my tone must have hurt her. "I beg your pardon," I said, or shouted, rather, in order to make myself heard above the roar of the rookery. "If you say so, I'll turn and go back. But honestly, I'd rather stay." "Now don't say that this is what you get for bringing a woman along," she said. She smiled at me, whimsically, gloriously, and I knew there was no need for forgiveness. I rowed a couple of 100 feet along the beach so as to recover my nerves, and then stepped ashore again. "Don't be cautious," she called after me. I nodded my head and proceeded to make a flank attack on the nearest harem. All went well until I aimed a blow at an outlying cow's head and fell short. She snorted and tried to scramble away. I ran in close and struck another bow, hitting the shoulder instead of the head. "Watch out," I heard Maud scream. In my excitement, I had not been taking notice of other things, and I looked up to see the lord of the harem charging down upon me. Again I fled to the boat, hotly pursued, but this time Maud made no suggestion of turning back. "It would be better, I imagine, if you let harems alone and devoted your attention to lonely and inoffensive-looking seals," was what I said. "I think I have read something about them. Dr. Jordan's book, I believe. They are the young bulls not old enough to have harems of their own. He called to the halashiki, or something like that. It seems to me if we find where they haul out... It seems to me that your fighting instinct is aroused." She flushed quickly and prettily. "I'll admit I don't like defeat any more than you do, or any more than I like the idea of killing such pretty, inoffensive creatures." "Pretty," I sniffed. I failed to mark anything preeminently pretty about those foamy-mouthed beasts that raced me. "Your point of view," she laughed. "You lack perspective. Now, if you did not have to get so close to the subject—" "The very thing," I cried. "What I need is a longer club. And there's that broken oar ready to hand." "It just comes to me," she said, "that Captain Larson was telling me how the men raided the rookeries. They drive the seals in small herds a short distance inland before they kill them." "I don't care to undertake the herding of those harems," I objected. "But there are the halashiki," she said. "The halashiki haul out by themselves, and Dr. Jordan says that paths are left between the harems, and that as long as the halashiki keep strictly to the path, they are unmolested by the masters of the harem." "There's one now," I said, pointing to a young bull in the water. "Let's watch him and follow him if he hauls out." He swam directly to the beach and clambered out into a small opening between 2 harems, the masters of which made warning noises but did not attack him. We watched him travel slowly inward, threading about the harems along what must have been the path. "Here goes," I said, stepping out, but I confess my heart was in my mouth as I thought of going through the heart of that monstrous herd. "It would be wise to make the boat fast," Maud said. She stepped out beside me, and I regarded her with wonderment. She nodded her head determinedly. "Yes, I'm going with you, so you may as well secure the boat and arm me with a club." "Let's go back," I said dejectedly. "I think Tundergrass will do after all." "You know it won't," was her reply. "Shall I lead?" With a shrug of the shoulders, but with the warmest admiration and pride at heart for this woman, I equipped her with a broken oar and took another for myself. It was with nervous trepidation that we made the first few rods of the journey. Once Maud screamed in terror as a cow thrust an inquisitive nose toward her foot, and several times I quickened my pace for the same reason. But beyond warning coughs from either side, there were no signs of hostility. It was a rookery which had never been raided by the hunters, and in consequence the seals were mild-tempered and at the same time unafraid. In the very heart of the herd, the din was terrific. It was almost dizzying in its effect. I paused and smiled reassuringly at Maud, for I had recovered my equanimity sooner than she. I could see that she was still badly frightened. She came close to me and shouted, "I'm dreadfully afraid!" And I was not. Though the novelty had not yet worn out, the peaceful comportment of the seals had quieted my alarm. Maud was trembling. "I'm afraid and I'm not afraid," she chattered with shaking jaws. "It's my miserable body, not I." It's all right, I reassured her, my arm passing instinctively and protectingly around her. I shall never forget in that moment how instantly conscious I became of my manhood. The primitive deeps of my nature stirred. I felt myself masculine, the protector of the weak, the fighting male. And best of all, I felt myself the protector of my loved one. She leaned against me, so light and lily-frail, and as trembling eased away, it seemed as though I became aware of prodigious strength. I felt myself a match for the most ferocious bull in the herd, and I know, had such a bull charged upon me, that I should have met it unflinchingly and quite coolly, and I know that I should have killed it. "I am all right now," she said, looking up at me gratefully. "Let us go on." And that the strength in me had quieted her and given her confidence filled me with an exultant joy. The youth of the race seemed burgeoning in me, over-civilized man that I was, and I lived for myself the old hunting days and forest nights of my remote and forgotten ancestry. I had much for which to thank Wolf Larsen, was my thought as we went along the path between the jostling harems. A quarter of a mile inland, we came upon the Holashiki. Sleek young bulls, living out the loneliness of their bachelorhood, and gathering strength against the day when they would fight their way into the ranks of the Benedicts. Everything now went smoothly. I seemed to know just what to do and how to do it, shouting, making threatening gestures with my club, and even prodding the lazy ones. I quickly cut out a score of the young bachelors from their companions. Whenever one made an attempt to break back toward the water, I headed it off. Maud took an active part in the drive, and with her cries and flourishings of the broken oar was of considerable assistance. I noticed, though, that whenever one looked tired and lagged, she let it slip past. But I noticed also, whenever one with a show of fight tried to break past, that her eyes glinted and showed bright, and she rapped it smartly with her club. "My, it's exciting," she cried, pausing from sheer weakness. "I think I'll sit down." I drove the little herd, a dozen strong now, what of the escapes she had permitted, 100 yards farther on, and by the time she joined me I had finished the slaughter and was beginning to skin. An hour later we went proudly back along the path between the harems, and twice again we came down the path burdened with skins, till I thought we had enough to roof the hut. I set the sail, laid one tack out of the cove, and on the other tack made our own little inner cove. "It's just like homecoming," Maud said, as I ran the boat ashore. I heard her words with a responsible thrill. It was all so dearly intimate and natural, and I said, "It seems as though I have lived this life always. The world of books and bookish folk is very vague, more like a dream memory than an actuality. I surely have hunted and forayed and fought all the days of my life, and you too seem part of it. You are," I was on the verge of saying, "my woman, my mate," but glibly changed it to "standing the hardship well." But her ear caught the flaw. She recognized a flight that midmost broke. She gave me a quick look. "Not that you were saying that the American Mrs. Meynell was living the life of a savage, and living it quite successfully," I said easily. "Oh," was all she replied, but I could have sworn there was a note of disappointment in her voice. But "my woman, my mate," kept ringing in my head for the rest of the day and for many days. Yet never did it ring more loudly than that night, as I watched her draw back the blanket of moss from the coals, blow up the fire, and cook the evening meal. It must have been latent savagery stirring in me, for the old words, so bound up with the roots of the race, to grip me and thrill me. And grip and thrill they did, till I fell asleep, murmuring them to myself over and over again.